On July 26, 1974, a young girl walking her dog through the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, made a discovery that would puzzle investigators for nearly 50 years. A woman, alone, unidentified, no hands, also no ID and no personal belonging, and no clear explanation for how she came to be there. Now, for decades, she was known only as the Lady of the Dunes, a mysterious woman without a name who met some tragic end. A case without leads. Investigators tried everything: facial reconstruction, comparing dental records. They reopened the case with modern forensics. They even exhumed the remains for updated DNA testing. Nothing revealed who she was or who may have been responsible. Her story grew into legend. Lots of rumors of who she was and what happened to her. But in 2022, after nearly half a century, advances in forensic genealogy finally uncovered the truth. She wasn't a tourist, she wasn't an unidentified drifter, she had a life, a family, and a history that crossed multiple states and included hidden relationships. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. Tonight we examine her life, her final days, and the decades-long investigation that followed. This is the Lady of the Dunes, one of New England's most enduring mysteries. Before she became known as the Lady of the Dunes, she had a name, a life, and a story. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry, born 1936 in Tennessee. According to investigators and family statements, she had ties to Tennessee, Michigan, California, and Massachusetts. She traveled often. She lived in several states and maintained relationships in multiple communities. This made tracing her movements difficult once she disappeared. Relatives described Ruth as warm, outgoing, and independent. She'd been previously married and had friendships scattered across the country. She lived on her own terms for long stretches. She was a daughter, a sister, and an aunt. People moved around a lot in the early 70s. Ruth was no exception. She didn't leave much of a paper trail. She changed jobs, changed addresses. She changed her names over the years, sometimes through marriage and sometimes to start over. Now that mobility, combined with the era's limited ability to track missing adults, is one reason Ruth's disappearance went unnoticed for so long. Family members didn't immediately suspect she vanished. Ruth had a habit of traveling for extended periods without regular contact and was known for making sudden moves from one state to another. To relatives who knew her and loved her, this was simply part of her personality. But investigators would later discover that in the months leading up to the summer of 1974, Ruth entered into a new relationship, one that took her to New England and, according to the Massachusetts authorities, may have placed her in danger. On the morning of July 26, 1974, the quiet dunes of Provincetown became the center of one of New England's most enduring mysteries. A young girl walking her dog near Race Point noticed a figure lying on a beach towel. From a distance, it looked like somebody sunbathing. But as she drew closer, she realized that the person wasn't moving. There was no response, and something about the scene didn't feel right, so she ran for help. When officers arrived, they immediately recognized this wasn't a medical emergency or case of someone who simply collapsed. The woman appeared to have been positioned deliberately, and the setting around her was remarkably undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no footprints indicating anybody recently approached or left the area. Investigators noticed details that suggested someone had taken steps to conceal her identity. Her hands were missing. The discovery raised immediate concern. She also suffered significant trauma to the head and facial area. Her injuries were severe enough to make visual identification impossible. To investigators, the findings strongly suggested the woman didn't die where she lay. Someone took steps to ensure she couldn't be identified. The scene was quiet. No evidence of a rush. No scattered belongings, and no obvious clues about how she arrived in this remote location. Race Point in the 70s was isolated, much more so than today. Winding sand roads, shifting dunes means limited access points, means that only a handful of people familiar with the area would venture this far. Investigators quickly attempted to match her to missing persons reports across Massachusetts and eventually across the entire country, but nothing matched. Nothing on her description. No match for her dental work. No missing persons matching her estimated age or physical characteristics. Now, within days, this mystery woman became known as the Lady of the Dunes. And the early clues, the isolated location, the careful positioning, the missing hands, and the effort to obscure her identity suggested that this wasn't a random tragedy. It looked like a case where someone didn't want her to be found. In fact, she would remain unidentified for nearly half a century. The investigation into the Lady of the Dunes began immediately. And at first, detectives believed the case might be solved quickly. They had a physical description, including distinctive dental work, and the Provincetown police were committed to identifying her. But instead of answers, the case morphed into a perplexing mystery. One of the first major clues was her dentistry. According to investigators, she underwent high-quality, expensive dental procedures, including crowns that were uncommon in the 1970s. Dentists described them as New York-style restorations, suggesting she once lived in or near a major metropolitan area. Likely came from a family with the means to afford this level of care. This should have narrowed the search, but it didn't. Police circulated dental charts statewide, then nationally. No match. Not a single missing person report aligned with her age, appearance, or dental history. Next came composite sketches. These were recreated with the help of forensic artists and medical examiners. Her face was reconstructed multiple times over the years using increasingly advanced techniques. Now, some sketches were refined versions. Others attempted to restore features affected by injury. But despite widespread distribution through newspapers, police bulletins, and national broadcasts, no one recognized her. Remarkable. Provincetown officers looked at the possibility that she might have been a seasonal worker or a traveler. The Cape's full of tourists in the summer, and a lot of young people came there for temporary jobs. Detectives interviewed waitresses, hotel staff, bar workers, anyone whose employment or travel patterns might have aligned with the time frame. No one remembered a young woman matching her description. Now for the forensic clue that stood out above all others, the removal of her hands. To investigators, this wasn't random. Whoever placed her in the dunes likely wanted to prevent fingerprint identification. This isn't uncommon as a calculated effort to delay or completely stop investigators from learning who she was. But the injury patterns also suggested something else. The person responsible had time. This wasn't a hurried act. It was deliberate. Police cast a wide net. They broadened their search to include recent disappearances from the Boston area and New York, missing women from nearby states, individuals tied to organized crime, women who recently left relationships or marriages, and travelers passing through the Cape that summer. Unfortunately, the mid-70s lacked modern databases. There wasn't a centralized national system for missing adults, and without fingerprints or a known identity, investigators were left comparing hundreds of missing person files manually. This is a lengthy process that ultimately yielded no useful match. The FBI was eventually consulted and the case was entered into a national law enforcement system, but still nothing. Witnesses canvassing along nearby trails, beaches, and cottages turned up no sightings of a woman traveling alone or with anyone suspicious in the days leading up to the discovery. It was like she arrived in Provincetown quietly and then vanished from every record that could have matched her with a name. By late 1974, the investigation hit its first major wall. Police had a body, a crime scene, and several forensic clues, but no identity, no clear suspect, and no origin story. Without these things, the case drifted into cold case territory earlier than anyone expected. But in the decades that followed, new developments and groundbreaking forensic techniques would bring investigators closer to learning who she was and who may have been responsible. As the years passed with no identification, investigators shifted from traditional police work to techniques that were ahead of their time. Each decade brought a new attempt to give the Lady of the Dunes her name, and each effort came close, but not close enough to solve the puzzle. In the late 70s, early 80s, forensic artists created several clay and charcoal reconstructions of the victim's face. These early models emphasized the distinctive features that investigators believed might trigger recognition. She had strong cheekbones, she had wide-set eyes, and a noticeable jawline. Law enforcement sent images across New England and the Northeast, and newspapers gave the case regional coverage. But despite the exposure, not a single credible name surfaced. Now, at the time, Provincetown officers still believed the case was solvable. A woman in her 30s with expensive dental work, a recognizable face, and likely interstate life. Somebody should have known her, and yet they didn't. By the late 90s, investigators realized that they reached the limit of what 1970s forensics could do. So in 2000, her body was exhumed so that modern examiners could preserve DNA samples and create an updated facial reconstruction. They'd reevaluate her injuries with improved techniques and verify estimated age with physical characteristics. DNA was successfully collected and preserved. That critical step would eventually lead to her identification decades later, but the technology in the early 2000s still wasn't capable of what forensic genealogy can do today. At the time, investigators hoped a national DNA match might reveal her identity, but none were found and the case remained cold. Then came the most bizarre twists in the case. one that turned the Lady of the Dunes into a cultural phenomenon. In 2015, author Joe Hill, the son of Stephen King, noticed something striking while rewatching Steven Spielberg's Jaws. In one scene, filmed on Martha's Vineyard in 1974, an extra walks through the background wearing a blue bandana and jeans. These are two details that matched early descriptions released by law enforcement. Hill suggested cautiously that the extra might have been the Lady of the Dunes. Not surprisingly, the theory exploded online. Blogs, YouTube channels, Reddit threads, thousands of people compared stills from the film to reconstruction images. And for a while, it became the most circulated explanation for who she may have been, but investigators remained skeptical. The timing, the filming location, and the travel distance didn't rule it out, but nothing definitively supported it either. Ultimately, when her identity was confirmed in 2022, officials stated clearly the extra in Jaws was not Ruth Marie Terry. Despite all this, the rumor kept the case alive in the public consciousness. It drew fresh eyes to a case that went quiet. Throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, investigators continued to feed DNA from the 2000 exhumation into national databases. But DNA matching for unidentified persons was still in its early days, and many of the systems lacked the cross-state compatibility that we take for granted today. Her profile produced no hits, no family matches, no partial matches. But that DNA preserved and waiting, that would become the foundation of the scientific breakthrough that finally solved the case, almost half a century later. For nearly 5 decades, investigators used every tool available to identify the Lady of the Dunes, but nothing worked. Then in 2022, everything changed. That year, the FBI and Massachusetts State Police partnered with experts in forensic genetic genealogy. It's the same technique used in cases like the Golden State Killer. Now, unlike traditional DNA matching, which relies on comparing a sample to an existing profile, forensic genealogy builds entire family trees from distant relatives whose DNA appears in consumer databases. It's not about finding one match. It's about finding dozens of partial matches, then using birth records, marriage certificates, and historical documents to identify someone who has never been in a database at all. Not an easy task. The process for the Lady of the Dunes began with a DNA sample extracted from her remains during the 2000 exhumation. The sample was converted into a detailed genetic profile, one that could be compared to millions of voluntary uploads in the public genealogy systems, databases like 23andMe. At first, the matches were distant. Fourth cousins, third cousins, family lines spread across the American South and Midwest. But as genealogists built out each branch, a pattern began to shape. One family line from Tennessee had an individual who vanished from the records in the early 70s. A woman whose relatives were wondering what happened to her. A woman who matched the age, ancestry, and physical characteristics of the unidentified victim. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. When investigators contacted her surviving relatives, they produced additional DNA samples. Those samples produced a definitive, conclusive match. After 48 years, the Lady of the Dunes finally had her identity restored. For her family, the discovery brought both relief and heartbreak. Ruth was missing for nearly half a century, but no one knew where to look, and no official missing person report was ever filed under her name. Now, like many adults in the early 70s, she moved frequently between states, sometimes under different last names due to marriage. Her relatives believed she was simply living independently. But the genealogy results came in, and the FBI confirmed publicly that the Lady of the Dunes was, without question, Ruth Marie Terry, age 37, originally from Tennessee. The identification opened the door to a new phase of the investigation, one that focused not on who she was, but on who she was with and where she'd been in the months before her death. That trail led investigators to a man with a long, complicated past and a history that raised immediate concern. Once investigators confirmed the Lady of the Dunes was Ruth Terry, they wanted to know who she was with. Now, that answer led directly to a man named Guy Rockwell Moldavan. It's a name that appears repeatedly in historical crime files going back decades. Now, when genealogists traced Ruth's movements leading up to the summer of '74, they discovered she'd recently married Moldavan. The two traveled cross-country together. They visited family in Tennessee and Michigan before heading east towards New England. And then in the summer of 1974, Ruth disappeared from all records tied to her name. Moldavan, however, kept moving. Moldavan was a traveling antique dealer and a show promoter. This is a job that kept him on the road and allowed him to move frequently without attracting much attention. Behind the work, history hit a troubling pattern. According to historical reporting, investigators later learned that Moldovan was linked to a 1950s disappearance in Washington state involving a previous wife and her teenage daughter. Although no charges were filed at the time, the circumstances were suspicious enough that police kept his name in regional case notes. By the time he met Ruth, Moldovan already lived multiple lives. He changed locations, changed relationships, and he occasionally changed the stories he told about his past. Family members told investigators that Ruth's contact became inconsistent after she began traveling with him. She seemed happy at first, but over time, communication dropped off and relatives weren't always sure where she was. The timeline is compelling because it cleanly aligns with Ruth's disappearance. Early 1974, Ruth and Moldovan traveled together across several states. Mid-1974, they're believed to be in the Northeast region. Summer of 1974, Ruth dies in Provincetown. Now, after 1974, Moldovan surfaces again. He's remarried with no mention of his previous wife. Investigators noted that Moldovan never reported Ruth missing. Not to local authorities or her family, not to anybody. Just moved on. This behavior is kinda sus. Combined with his earlier history, his mobility efforts that clearly worked to conceal Ruth's identity, Moldovan became the prime suspect. But there was a complication. By the time Ruth's identity was confirmed in 2022 and investigators publicly named Moldovan as the likely person responsible, he'd been dead for nearly 20 years. He passed away in 2002, 2 years after her exhumation. With no surviving spouse, partner, or a witness from 1974 willing or able to fill in the gaps, the case effectively reached its investigative endpoint. Still, the forensics evidence, the pattern of relationships, the unexplained disappearance surrounding him and Ruth's final movements, it creates a compelling story that investigators believe leads directly back to Moldovan. The Lady of the Dunes didn't die at random. She didn't wander into Provincetown by accident. Her presence there aligns with a man whose past was buried beneath decades of travel and misdirection. Even though no charges were ever filed, it kind of looks like Moldovan was responsible. When investigators look back at the Lady of the Dunes case, one question stands out above all others. How did a woman with a name, a family, and a life disappear so completely and remain unidentified for 48 years? The answer is a combination of timing, geography, and the limits of 1970s investigative tools. No missing person report was ever filed. Ruth Terry frequently moved between states. She stayed with relatives. She lived independently for long stretches and often traveled without a fixed schedule. Her family didn't expect her constant contact. When she didn't call, they assumed that she was on the road. Maybe she was settling somewhere new or taking time for herself. Communication stopped after 1974 and no one immediately suspected danger. Remember, there was no missing person report. Without a missing person report, the case starts at a disadvantage. Today, investigators can match forensic evidence and missing person reports across 50 states in minutes. In 1974, none of that existed. It meant Ruth could be missing in Tennessee or Michigan, while her unidentified remains were in Massachusetts. No one had a system capable of connecting the two. The seasonal population complicated the case. Provincetown is a seasonal magnet for a lot of people. It still is. Tourists, artists, summer workers, transient visitors, people just starting over. In the 1970s, thousands of people came and went with no digital trail. No credit card statements, sometimes no formal identification at all. If Ruth arrived in Provincetown with Moldovan days or weeks before her death, it's likely no one in town ever knew her name. Also makes later facial reconstructions almost impossible to match. From the get-go, investigators noticed that whoever placed Ruth in the dunes took deliberate steps to prevent her from being identified. Complete lack of personal belongings. How about the missing hands and injury patterns that made fingerprinting and visual identification impossible? In an era without DNA or computerized records, removing these markers meant law enforcement had almost nothing to work with. Even her dental work, which was distinctive and expensive, even that couldn't be matched without a dentist or a family member coming forward. In Provincetown, her story became local legend. Her facial reconstructions appeared on multiple police posters, news segments, and later across the internet. People speculated about who she was and where she came from. What might have brought her to such an isolated place? For many, she became a symbol of the unknown, a story with just enough clues to keep people searching, but never enough to reach the truth. The Jaws rumor kept her in the public eye for years. It didn't solve the case, but it made her unforgettable. Ruth's identification wasn't just a breakthrough in her case, it was a turning point in modern criminal investigation. forensic genealogy transformed a file that was cold for nearly half a century into one that could finally be solved. It doesn't just match samples, it builds the story backward from distant relatives to one missing person who fell between the cracks long before the digital records existed. And in Ruth's case, it worked. A woman who vanished from every official record in 1974 suddenly reappeared through thousands of tiny genetic clues assembled by experts who never gave up on her. Ruth's story also reveals something about how cold cases form. She wasn't reported missing, her identity was concealed, her death happened in a transient area during the height of tourist season, and the country lacked the forensic or digital tools needed to trace her. In another era, this case would have remained a mystery forever. It was ultimately solved not because of new witnesses or a confession. Science needed the time to catch up with her story. What happened after the identification is perhaps the most meaningful part of this case. For the first time in 50 years, Ruth Terry's family learned the truth. Her relatives, some who hadn't seen her in decades, finally understood what happened and where she'd been all this time. For them, the identification brought clarity, not closure. For investigators, it offered a final answer to the question that hovered over Cape Cod for generations. Ruth traveled through multiple states in the months before her death: Tennessee, Michigan, possibly California, and then eventually Massachusetts. Her husband traveled widely and frequently changed addresses. In the 1970s, a missing adult wasn't always considered a police matter. States didn't routinely share missing person information, and unidentified remains in one jurisdiction rarely triggered reviews in another. Ruth slipped into the cracks of a system not yet built to handle multi-state disappearances. By the time technology caught up, many early investigators had retired. Case files were reorganized multiple times. Evidence had to be reevaluated after decades of storage. Even the 2000 exhumation couldn't reveal her identity because forensic genealogy didn't exist. The technology needed to solve the case wouldn't be invented for another 15 years. When you put these factors together, the picture becomes clear. No one reported Ruth missing. Her identity was intentionally obscured. Provincetown's transient population left few witnesses. Record-keeping systems weren't centralized. DNA comparison wasn't possible. And the person investigators believe was responsible died decades before her identification. So, it wasn't that the case was unsolvable. It's that the tools didn't exist to solve it. I'm John Genoa, and you've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.